Imagine walking through ancient Rome on a sweltering summer day. The streets are packed, the air thick with dust, and over 1 million people crammed into a city that by all logic should have collapsed under its own weight. But something kept Rome alive. Something invisible, running beneath the streets, cascading through fountains, and flowing into public baths, fresh, clean water. And the man who wrote the rulebook on how to deliver it was an engineer named Marcus Vitruvius Polio. Most people have never heard of Vitruvius. He wasn't an emperor or a gladiator. He never led an army into battle. But his work arguably saved more lives than any Roman general ever did. In the 1st century BC, Vitruvius wrote a 10-volume masterpiece called De Architectura, and buried within those pages was something revolutionary, a complete engineering guide to finding, testing, transporting, and purifying water for an entire civilization. He dedicated the work to Emperor Augustus, hoping it would serve as a permanent reference for every builder and planner in the Roman world. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what water meant in the ancient world, or more accurately, what bad water meant. Contaminated water was the single greatest killer of human beings for most of recorded history. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, parasitic infections. These diseases didn't just kill individuals, they wiped out entire communities. A single contaminated well could devastate a village in weeks. Even armies feared bad water more than enemy swords. More soldiers throughout history died from waterborne illness than from combat wounds, and in a city the size of Rome, with over 1 million residents, the margin for error was essentially zero. Before Vitruvius, water engineering was mostly guesswork. Civilizations had built aqueducts before Rome. The Assyrians and Greeks both moved water across distances. But nobody had systematized the science behind it. Nobody had asked the fundamental questions. How do you know if a water source is safe? How do you move water across hundreds of kilometers without it becoming contaminated? How do you distribute it fairly across an entire city? These were not philosophical puzzles. They were life and death engineering problems, and getting any one of them wrong meant epidemic disease. Vitruvius answered all of these questions, and he started with something surprisingly modern: water quality testing. He described methods for evaluating water sources that would not look out of place in a basic chemistry textbook. He recommended observing the health of people living near springs. He suggested examining the physical characteristics of water, its clarity, taste, and smell. He even recommended boiling water and checking for residue, a technique that essentially anticipates the concept of dissolved solids testing. He also noted that water from different geological formations had different properties, observing that water flowing through rocky mountain terrain tended to be purer than water collected from swampy lowlands. But finding clean water was only the beginning. The real challenge was moving it. Rome's population demanded an almost unimaginable volume of fresh water every single day. Estimates suggest that at its peak, Rome's aqueduct system delivered roughly 1 million cubic meters of water daily. That is more water per person than many modern cities provide today. To put that in perspective, each Roman citizen had access to roughly 1,000 liters per day, a figure that includes public fountains, baths, and industrial use. Vitruvius laid out precise engineering principles for making this happen. He specified the ideal gradient for aqueduct channels, recommending a slope of roughly 0.5 meter for every 100 meters of length. Too steep, and the water would erode the channel. Too shallow, and it would stagnate and breed disease. He calculated flow rates, described how to build settling tanks to remove sediment, and designed distribution systems that could serve different neighborhoods at different pressures. He even addressed the problem of airlocks and closed pipe systems, describing ventilation techniques that prevented pressure buildup from bursting the conduits. The aqueducts themselves were engineering marvels. The popular image is of towering stone arches marching across the landscape, and those certainly existed. The Pont du Gard in southern France stands nearly 50 meters tall and still inspires awe 2,000 years later. Built from massive limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, it carried water across the Gardanne River Valley with a gradient so precise that the water dropped just 17 meters over its entire 50-kilometer journey. But here is something most people don't realize. Roughly 90% of Rome's aqueduct system ran underground. Those spectacular bridges were actually the exception, built only when the terrain demanded it. Most of the network consisted of carefully engineered underground channels lined with waterproof cement, gently sloping downhill for dozens or even hundreds of kilometers. Vitruvius understood something that many ancient engineers did not. He recognized that lead pipes, which were commonly used for water distribution, could be dangerous. In De Architectura, he specifically warned against using lead for water conveyance. He had observed that workers in lead foundries suffered from poor health, and he made the logical connection that water flowing through lead might carry similar risks. He recommended ceramic or stone pipes instead. This observation was roughly 2,000 years ahead of its time. The world would not fully acknowledge the dangers of lead in water until the 20th century. Even today, lead contamination remains a public health crisis in some communities, a problem Vitruvius identified before the birth of Christ. This wasn't just theoretical knowledge. The systems Vitruvius described were actually built, and they worked on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, spanning a combined distance of over 500 kilometers. The system fed hundreds of public fountains, dozens of massive public baths, and countless private connections. The baths of Caracalla alone could accommodate over 6,000 bathers simultaneously, and every drop of water had to arrive clean, fresh, and at the right pressure. The public health impact was staggering. Roman citizens had access to clean water that was arguably safer than what many people drank in European cities as recently as the 1800s. The great cholera epidemics that devastated London in the 19th century were caused by exactly the kind of water contamination that Roman engineering had already solved 2 millennia earlier. When John Snow traced the 1854 cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, he was essentially rediscovering principles that Vitruvius had documented in the age of Caesar. But Vitruvius gave Rome more than just plumbing. His water systems enabled something even more important: urban density. Clean water made it possible for over 1 million people to live in close proximity without catastrophic disease outbreaks. It enabled public baths, which were essential for hygiene in a world without soap as we know it. It enabled fountains that cooled the air and lifted spirits. It enabled the very concept of a functional megacity at a time when most human settlements numbered in the hundreds or low thousands. When Rome eventually fell, its water infrastructure crumbled with it. Invading armies deliberately cut aqueducts to force cities into surrender. The Ostrogoths severed Rome's aqueducts during the siege of 537 AD, and the city's population plummeted from over 1 million to fewer than 50,000 within a generation. Without maintenance, the great channels silted up, the arches crumbled, and the engineering knowledge that had built them was largely forgotten. Europe plunged into centuries of waterborne disease. Medieval cities were notorious death traps where contaminated water and open sewers created perfect conditions for epidemics. It took nearly 1,500 years for European civilization to match what Rome had achieved. The great public waterworks of the 19th century, the systems that finally tamed cholera and typhoid in cities like London and Paris, were in many ways simply rediscovering what Vitruvius had already known. Engineers of the Industrial Revolution studied De Architectura and marveled at the sophistication of Roman water systems. Today, Vitruvius is mostly remembered by architects for his theory of proportion, the idea that buildings should embody firmness, commodity, and delight. Leonardo da Vinci immortalized his name with the famous Vitruvian Man drawing. But his most important legacy is not about proportion or beauty, it is about survival. His water engineering principles formed the foundation for systems that kept millions of people alive across centuries of Roman civilization. The next time you turn on a faucet and clean water flows out, consider the invisible chain of engineering that makes it possible. The pipes beneath your street, the treatment plant on the edge of town, the reservoir in the hills. That chain stretches back over 2,000 years, to a quiet Roman engineer who understood that civilization itself flows through water. Marcus Vitruvius never commanded a legion or conquered a province. But by writing down how to find, move, and deliver clean water, he saved more lives than any emperor who ever lived, and his principles are still keeping us alive today.